Irreverent, entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Mary Baca, and I am airing from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And just to tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, I'm a licensed therapist and holistic practitioner with two businesses in Albuquerque, New Mexico. One is Odyssey Counseling, a business I've had for 26 plus years, and the second business is Resilience Integrative Services. I am a trauma specialist trained in EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing. It is a phenomenal treatment for trauma and all kinds of things. I'm a certified applied kinesiologist, certified Reiki practitioner, and recently certified hypnotherapist. I've been in my field of practice for 30 plus years, and so in this time I have become very familiar with the topic at hand, which is fear. Actually, last week my guest and I, Lupita Gutilet de Martinez, and I talked about fear, what it is and that kind of thing, and this week we're going to talk about overcoming fear. Within the last 30 years, I've seen people at different levels and stages of fear. One of the populations that I specialize in treating are people who have post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress. And so, as you can imagine, there is definitely fear in those kinds of conditions. I want to welcome Lupita onto the show, and let me tell you who she is. Lupita Gutilet de Martinez is a certified medical support, clinical hypnotherapist, spiritual advisor, and life coach, specializing in self-empowerment and personal transformation. Lupita has extensively studied indigenous forms of health and healing. She's a Stanford University School of Medicine certified master trainer for their suite of self-management programs, where she teaches people life skills so they feel better and improve their quality of life. Lupita is currently in private practice in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Welcome to the show again, Lupita. Thank you for coming on again.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad to be here. I'm excited about the topic and how we can help people.
Yeah, definitely. And, before we started airing, I was joking with Lupita that I had a little bit of fear this morning as I started a new gym. And after kind of getting back to it, back to working out, after a long break, I was a little nervous, a little anxious going into it, but, I conquered it, and I'm really excited and enthused about this gym. It's called Titanium Fitness, and I know a few people that have gone through their program and just look amazing and feel amazing. So, that's one of the things with fear, right, is overcoming it, working on it, identifying it, and being able to overcome it. So,
and I think that's a really good point, Mary, is that, fear is going to come up, pretty much throughout, that there's, that it's going to come up in our daily lives, and especially when we're dealing with something new, just as you mentioned, with your personal experience this morning.
Right. And sometimes even when, it's not completely new, but I still had some fear because it's been a long time. And so, I want people to know that fear, a certain level of fear, is normal. But what would you say? What would you say are some of the mental symptoms of fear that you've seen in the people that you've worked with and provided services to?
Well, in regard to the mental symptoms, because it does show up in a various forms. We have the mental, emotional, and physical, and so the mental symptoms that come up are with thoughts that linger in our mind. So, if we ever stop and think about or just pay attention to the thoughts that we think every day, we would be amazed at how random they are, and then the form or the state of which they are. So, are they positive? Are there negative self-talk? Or are they, in this case, specifically fearful thoughts? And so the mental aspect is about beating ourselves up. It's like either we are obsessing about something that we're afraid of, and the thoughts of it go round and round and round in our mind. When we have those types of thoughts or that kind of obsessive thoughts, it could also impact our sleep because our mind is going too much. We can't turn it off at the end of the day. It can be disruptive in the middle of the day. We might find ourselves wandering in thought, and especially about the things that are fearful. So that's what that would look like. So the mental symptoms are just feeling really fatigued, feeling drained, not being able to focus or concentrate, inability to really achieve tasks, maybe having a hard time formulating our words, and then again the fear, just the thoughts that go around in our head. So those are the primary things with the mental symptoms.
Well, one of the things I talk to people a lot about is dwelling. So many people I see, Lupita, dwell and dwell and dwell, and it's usually fear-based. A lot of times it's irrational, but it's usually fear-based of what they just cannot get their minds off of.
And when we don't give it an outlet, Mary, that it stays lingering in the mind, and then one thought leads to another. It's contagious. It's like a chain reaction. So I think everybody's had this form of experience of where they think of one negative thought or one fearful thought, and then that fearful thought leads to other fearful thoughts that lead to other things that they were afraid of. And so just by thoughts alone, we're actually able to have that outcome. Our mind is extraordinarily powerful. This is why I love the field of clinical hypnotherapy and hypnotherapy in general, because it all has to do with the power of the mind. That there's a lot of buzzwords out there about, being mindful and practicing mindfulness. And what does that even mean? So oftentimes, when people are in a fear state, those thoughts do dwell, and they do contribute one to another, and in that chain reaction. So the practice of being mindful means that we're paying attention to what we're doing in the present moment. And so that's one of the most incredible ways that a person can actually help interrupt when they feel that the mental drain of the fearful thoughts, of just interrupting it, because oftentimes it's fear of something that has already happened, so they're dwelling on the event. And then also the fear, as we talked about last week, that anxiety is the basal state for something that's completely new. The things that we're afraid of and the unknown. Say we're about to experience something new and where we don't know what to expect, and so there's that overall feeling of anxiety. And so those are all mental states. And by being able to use the power of our mind, by controlling and monitoring and managing the thoughts that we think, is one of the most important, if not the most important, vital steps when we're dealing with fear.
It is. A lot of times, though, pretty routinely, I tell people space is your friend. So if a person is just dwelling and obsessing and dwelling and obsessing, I tell them, take space from it, true space from it, to where you're completely distracted and thinking about something else. And it's really hard for people sometimes to get out of that loop, that loop of whatever thought pattern that they're caught up in that's fear-based.
Exactly. One of the most important parts is to just begin to have a state of awareness of them monitoring themselves. So often we are on autopilot. It's like we're doing tasks, we're going through our day, we're driving to work, and our thoughts are uncontrolled. They just run rampant and wild. And so by being able to monitor first and foremost the thoughts, and then by being able to recognize, oh my God, here I go again. I'm thinking of all of this fear. And oftentimes we could do one of two things. We can either beat ourselves up about, oh my God, here I go again, or we can actually just be thankful for the moment that we're able to stop and recognize it. So acknowledging when we are having fear-based thoughts. So that's one of the first steps is, okay, I'm feeling it or I'm thinking it right now. Because this is the interesting part, is that we think about our feeling and we feel about our thinking. And which means that emotions come up as well as with the mental states. So that's why they talk about the mind-body connection. What we think about, we actually physically can feel. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of the thoughts, when we're able to identify and recognize that fearful thoughts are coming up, and then we can interrupt that fear cycle in that mental state by using the power of our mind. And exactly what you said is using distraction techniques. So some forms of mind distraction techniques are those that are done just solely with the use of the mind. In other words, we can begin to think of perhaps counting backwards from 1,000 by threes, or maybe thinking of a name of a flower for every letter of the alphabet. Or we can begin to play like a baseball game in our head. We can think of the lyrics of a favorite song or a poem. Anything that is going to distract our thoughts, because the incredible thing is our mind cannot focus on two different things at once. We think we can. We think we can multitask, but in reality, we're splitting our attention between two things when we think we're multitasking. Our mind can really only focus on one thing at a time. So when we create distraction techniques from the fear thoughts, that's a powerful form of interruption.
Well, one of the types of therapy that I do, and a lot of counselors, not just me, do, is cognitive behavioral therapy, which has to do completely with the mind and thoughts and thought substitution. So it goes with what you just said about, you cannot think two opposing thoughts at the same time. One will cancel out the other. So if you are thinking something negative or fearful, and you make yourself think about something positive or neutral, that is most likely to cancel out the negative or fearful thought that's going on. It's pretty powerful. And the other thing too with different methods or different ways that you can deal with fear-based thoughts or feelings, I always tell people that to have a menu of options. Because, not the same thing is going to work every single time for the same person. So it's good to have a menu of options of different things that we're mentioning today.
Absolutely. So that they have a toolbox.
Right.
That we can't build a house with just a hammer, that we have a toolbox with all kinds of different tools that can work at various moments.
And the best time to put your toolbox together is when you are doing well. Because
Exactly.
if you wait until you're in the moment and you're struggling, it's harder. So, hopefully everybody listening to this show will, use some of the things that we're talking about to build your toolbox.
And one of the things with the toolbox in terms of building up our techniques and skills for addressing fear when it comes to the mind is exactly that, of being able to identify first when the thoughts are coming up, having easy, ready access distraction techniques, something that tends to work for you. The third thing is also what you said about, creating something and having a go-to. So another technique can also be, and I love that you used exercise as, going to a new exercise facility as something that was one of your examples of being, kind of fearful because it's new or the exercise place is new. So just like building any muscle, it is also important to know that we can train our minds. So we can't go and run a marathon when we haven't exercised at all, right? So this is another opportunity using that same example, is that we're going to build our mind muscle to begin to focus on things that are more positive or more neutral or that feel better. And so we do that through a practice, right? It requires practice. It requires like a daily workout, exercising the mind with positive thoughts. And one of the most important things, and I want to be really clear here because it's not about pretending that our fear doesn't exist. Our fear, we're feeling it. It's validated. We know it to be true because we're experiencing it. So it's not about pretending that it doesn't exist or saying I'm afraid, and then from the immediate next moment saying, I'm fearless. So it takes a process, and it's not about disregarding it. So one, honoring the emotion when it does come up and thanking it because it's showing us something. And then in building that muscle, we can develop something like a go-to. And one of those, a beautiful technique, and when we're feeling better, is that what you mentioned earlier, Mary, is about, having a notebook, a small little spiral notebook that you can carry with you or have easy access to it. And when you are feeling good, begin to write things that you're either like a gratitude, not so much a gratitude journal, but perhaps like some basic things. For example, I was doing a training up in Taos just last week, and I had to stay overnight because it was an extensive training, and there was the most beautiful tree outside my window. Outside the balcony, actually. And I took pictures of that tree because it had these beautiful pink blossoms. And I took a moment to just acknowledge that, like, wow, this is beautiful. You know, we're springtime in northern New Mexico. And so that would be a perfect opportunity where I could write that experience down in the journal, like beautiful pink blossoms. You know, maybe write the date, and then to have the feeling that I had was awe. And so that I build up those experiences, writing them in the little journal, so that when I'm not feeling good and I find a thought or an experience that I can remember easily, because when we're in it, it's from it. So by having that spiral with easy, ready examples that I have already experienced of good moments can be a powerful way to shift my mind. And by remembering that experience will begin to give me the feeling of that experience, which will interrupt the fear thought and also create positive emotions.
And, you know, whatever works for you guys. Like, one thing, I know a lot of people will take notes on their phone, and I do too. Like, if you don't want to carry, you know, a piece of paper and pen with you, you know, these smartphones that we have are incredible, you know, and they all have like a notepad. And the other thing too is, whatever makes you feel like that tree she saw, it may be the sound of an engine for those guys, you know, that like to work on cars, or like a nice muscle car, you know. Whatever it is for you that you can associate good things with, so be it. You know, it's the tree. I could certainly appreciate the tree that you were describing, you know, but whatever works for you, you know, go with it.
Absolutely, make it personal. You know, so what works for one may not work for the other. And this is the reason that we're building the toolbox, is because we're going to have a whole variety of tools. And these are what we're talking about today, is some suggestions that someone can begin to create, to build and develop, and that we don't have to use all of them at once. And something that we suggest may not work, you know, in the immediate, but it might, you know, be there and available to use in the future. So absolutely make it personal. Make it something that is relevant to you.
Right. I just know because sometimes I'll tell my clients about that tree and they're like, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
That's
right.
not
What
going
I'm
to
in
work
the
for
you
me.
want me to look at a pink tree?
Right.
Understood. Exactly. So it's like, and I think that with that example, it's more about appreciating what's in front of us right now. You know, so say it is somebody who really does appreciate. And I have a neighbor actually who has some motorcycles, and like clockwork on Sundays, you know, that's the thing that he likes to work with. So that's something that is personal, something relevant, something important, something special directly for you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you know, moving along, what are some of the emotional symptoms of fear?
So, as we mentioned before, that the thoughts can lead to and evoke emotions. And so some of the emotions and the emotional symptoms of fear is where we begin to feel that anxiety that we talked about. It's a looming feeling like something is just, we are on edge. We feel like hyper irritable. Any kind of sound might set us off a little bit. We might be edgy, and it might be not so much it might present as anger, but it also might present as just like being annoyed, like having a general sense of annoyance. We could be withdrawn. So we may not want to do the things that we want to do. So using the example of the motorcycle, we may not want to go riding for a while, that we find ourselves not doing the things that we love to do. And that does create an emotional response where we become distant, either shut down. And one of the other things that we really have to be careful of is that for a few people, depending on the level of fear, their activity, they might be in a hyper state, so like kind of in a manic state, where they're overdoing or just to try to occupy or distract. And so with the emotional withdrawn, tired, fatigued, not feeling good, not doing the things we want to do and love, and that it creates that disconnect, not only from ourselves, but also from our loved ones. So we might find our family members asking more often, "Are you okay? what's going on? What's wrong? And we might snap back and say, nothing's wrong. Stop asking me. So that's something that may come up. And we also might also find that because we lack focus, or we might be missing things, so we might not be fulfilling agreements or making appointments or being more forgetful, and which also badgers us, and we feel down and we beat ourselves up over it. So those are some emotional things that come up around fear, which looks very close like depression, but fear can lead to that.
Right.
And so we have to be really careful about, and then fear could also leave us in that state of paralysis that we talked about, of not wanting to do anything, fearful to make decisions. We might not, we just completely shut down in that state.
Right. I think that those are all really great and make the point that a lot of times you have to work it backwards. So you might recognize the symptom and then work it backward and get down to what the real issue is, which is oftentimes fear. Because, if I were to tell somebody, because I do try, right, to point out fear, and they're like, no, I'm not afraid. What are you talking about? I'm not afraid. And then as we work on it more and more, they realize that, yes, they do have fear as an issue, and that even if it's irrational, it's still very powerful. But sometimes you have to work it backward from starting with the symptom and acknowledging the symptom, and then kind of, trace it to where that symptom started from.
Yes, and so having that awareness and exactly, and being introspective. So, sometimes the hardest thing to do is when we're in it and we're feeling it, the last thing we want to do is stop and take a pause and assess. But, that's what is actually being called to do, is that, again, our emotions are there for a reason. It doesn't feel good in the moment, but the sooner we can identify what the cause is or what the underlying circumstances are, and either we work it backwards or forward, it requires and forces us to look at ourselves and to assess where we're at and look at what's happening around us. And even maybe have someone that's close to us, that we can actually rely upon. And we may or may not have the benefit and the beauty of having somebody like that. But if for those who do, that would be a really good example to have someone be our eyes and ears to recognize. And our loved ones typically would do that of their own will when they see that we're struggling with something.
And it benefits them. Too, because then
because we won't be snapping at them so much anymore.
Right. So it's a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely.
How do you think fears develop?
So fears develop, let's see, there's different types. So one can actually stem from childhood. So last week we used the example of a person whose job was to speak in public, and that they had a dread every time they had to get up in front of a group, only to realize that there was something that happened to them as a very young child that, say, the teacher who embarrassed them in front of the school group or the classroom because they misspelled the word cat, maybe with a K instead of a C. That's a perfect example. So it could have stemmed from childhood. Other times it can come from something very real. So many people are dealing with very difficult daily situations. Maybe they're in a volatile home. Maybe they're experiencing violence to some degree, or some form of life change that is making everybody in the home very excitable and even negative, or even could be again violent or abusive. So I think it requires us to look at our own situations, and when we're in it, seek help that we need to address the situation in the immediate moment. Another type of fear is the fear of the unknown. Maybe we're wanting to pursue a dream. For example, someone who maybe as a teenager wanted to be an artist, and then we're told time and time again that artists they can't make a good living and it's difficult. So then a belief implanted in them thinking that I can't survive as an artist. So they choose a job, say an accounting job, which accounting is great, but if the truly part within them is to be artistic and to be an artist, that might feel to that person like they're not fulfilling their heart's desire. So it becomes this deeper longing within themselves, and then there are beliefs, thoughts, or ideas that were either developed on their own or were told to them by someone else that made them feel like they couldn't accomplish that. And so that's another fear. And so the fear of fear of change. Change is another thing that is probably one of the greatest challenges when it comes to fear-based thoughts and just experiencing fear. So wanting to make a change and not knowing how. And whether we want to make that change. So in this example, say the accountant who wants to transition to be an artist, wondering how they're going to make it, or changes being imposed upon us. Maybe we're in a situation, a marriage or a long relationship where the other person is choosing to make a change. Maybe there's a distance being created, or they're actually going through a divorce, for example. So maybe almost out of their own will that this change is happening to them. Another example is the loss of a job or the loss of a loved one even. And so when we're experiencing change in our life, it creates a ton of fear. And because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what to expect. We don't know how our livelihood is going to be and what's going to come of it. So that's another extraordinary way that fears are developed.
That's a big one for people. I mean, talk about getting paralyzed. People stay in, unhealthy relationships and jobs, or they ignore their health, because of the fear of change. If they look at that, and that's a biggie for people.
It is. And this is the other part. We all have heard the saying, like the only thing that's constant is change. And when we understand that change is part of the process of life, then we can begin to make peace with it. Like especially when things are going really well, when we've had a sudden change, unexpected, that could be really difficult to manage. But when we understand that change is part of life, that it's part of this natural flow of how we experience, our daily lives. And that's one way that we can actually begin to make peace with it. And we don't have to be afraid of change. But when we're in it, developing tools beforehand of how we can actually manage it. I hope that's making sense.
It is. And a lot of times what I'll do too is I'll have people take their fear apart. So if they're afraid of change, I'll kind of take it apart and say, well, let's look at what you're afraid of specifically. And a lot of times as they're taking it apart and verbalizing what they're afraid of, some of that will dissipate, in itself, because they realize, well, that's not really something I need to be afraid of,
Exactly. And using that example for myself of when it was a true-to-life example of wanting to leave my job to open up my full-time practice rather than having a part-time practice. And what I had to do was exactly that, pick it apart. So I was able to work with a friend, and my friend, in this case, or you can even do it alone on your own if you chose to, is to write down the fears. And so when I actually was able to identify it, the worst-case scenario, like what's the worst that could happen? And oftentimes, our fears are created from something that is, like you said, irrational. So using myself as the example is I was terrified of losing my job because I wanted the security of the Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, steady paycheck. And so understanding that, okay, well, when I spoke it, it was like even hearing myself say it was, okay, well, I can die. And I was like, well, okay, how can you die by just leaving your job? So listing out all of no matter how irrational or how crazy it sounds, writing down all the fears that we might be having. And then in a rational state, and so it's going to require that we're in a place where we can actually self-assess, right? So we may not be able to do it in the moment that we're feeling that extreme fear. But eventually, when our emotions calm down and our thoughts are a little bit more clear, we can use this process of breaking it down, listing all the fears that we might be thinking of, and then also understanding that, like, okay, well, I'm not going to die. What's the next worst thing that could happen? And so breaking it down and that can actually getting it out writing it down so that those thoughts aren't being dwelt on. Oftentimes we dwell on fears because we don't give them a place to go. It's like they're just floating around in there. So this is a way to get it out so that the thoughts aren't floating.
And that's the same for any emotion. It's holding things in that keep things alive, all this destructive thinking and self-defeating thoughts. And so, right, with any emotions, if you write it down or you talk about it, you let it out, they're fluid. Emotions are fluid and they will move and get out of your way,
And this is a really good part to talk about. I talked about needing the safety and the security of my paycheck and thinking that I wasn't going to be able to make it, right? So using that example, where does that come from? That the psychologist Abraham Maslow created, the 8 steps to inner peace. There's a pyramid where we have to assess where we're at right now. Are my needs being met? So the very first thing is that, do we have our physical needs? So do I have a home? Do I have food? Do I have a way to secure income? The next thing would be safety. Do I feel safe and secure in my environment? Am I subjecting myself to things that I shouldn't? Am I in an abusive relationship, even abusive work situations? So making sure that we then address our sense of safety and security. And then the next level above that is a feeling of being able to belong, being part of a group, something that is greater than ourselves. Perhaps it's that could be a church, it could be a bike club, it could be a writing group, something that gives us that sense of belonging that eventually builds our self-esteem. So I think with fear, the first and foremost is that we might be experiencing something somewhere along the lines that our needs are not being met. And so that's another really vital, important step is what do I need and want? And if I'm not in receiving what I need and want, what are some ways that I could either make change to help me make that change, make it happen so that I do feel, my needs are being, I'm feeling more safe or that I do belong. And then that is really critical to understanding ourselves, gives us insight. And again, being okay that it's a process and that we can get stronger and stronger as we develop and use more of these tools.
Right. Rome wasn't conquered in a day, so it's okay. This is going to take time, and that's all right.
Absolutely.
Since fear can be normal, what do how can someone tell when they are experiencing normal fear versus if they're needing to seek help for it?
Okay, good question. So the next thing is to identify that if we're afraid of change, using that example, and the fear might come up when the person begins to make more or have a better awareness that they're wanting something different in their life. So again, using myself as the example, that when I first had the prospect of making that change, it felt pretty subtle. It almost felt like a fear that was somewhere way out there because I wasn't very serious at the time about, in other words, I wasn't going to leave my job tomorrow. So it's nothing that I really had to deal with in that moment. Now, the sad part is that when we're not addressing our needs and wants and the desire to move towards change is stronger and stronger, it is met with the equal amount of fear. So the closer I got to making that change, the more afraid I became. And so it brought it to the forefront that I had to deal with it in the immediate. I was no longer able to just push it aside. So when our fears become more intense, maybe because of this time lapse as the example that I've used, in the opposite end, it could also be sudden and instant. Again, when we're dealing with a change that we did not initiate, the loss of a loved one, perhaps an accident, maybe the loss of a job, that's imposed upon us. And so when it's outside the normal range, it's by being aware of our responses. Am I becoming further withdrawn? Am I more irritable? Am I lashing out? Am I shutting down? And so by paying attention to our responses is also going to show us where we're at. So this is what I love about emotion, is that emotion is there to show us where we are. So the level of fear and the depth of fear is equal to the either what needs to happen to shift or change or something that we have to address. It's there to communicate something to us. And in situations like the fight or flight, I used the example last week with women who are might put themselves in a dangerous situation, even against their gut feeling. So that's something else to pay attention to. When we have those deep, intense gut, visceral feelings of, I don't think this is safe. We should pay attention to that because it's a heightened magnitude, and then try not to analyze it and think it away. Like, oh, I shouldn't be afraid. There's this person. I don't know this person. There's no reason for me to be afraid. All the while, this person might have like dangerous thoughts or intentions. So paying attention to our fear.
Right. One of the things that, one of the emotions that I see a lot of people really in touch with, and not so much other things like fear that are more vulnerable kinds of emotions to feel or admit to, is anger. So I see a lot of people really, and look at the world we live in. What is the one emotion you see expressed a lot? Anger. And though that's a mask, a lot of times for things like fear that are just more vulnerable to feel. So I think that's important too, is somebody might be really disconnected from any other emotions but anger, and almost read it like it's not even on their radar. Well, I don't have fear. I'm pissed off. I'm upset. I'm frustrated, all these anger emotions, but I don't have fear, when really they might have the most fear than anybody.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting too.
And that's why developing a sense of, when I say self-awareness, it sounds like such a woo-woo concept, right? It's not this new agey, touchy-feely kind of concept. The thing is that most people are very disconnected from themselves. We go through our day, we wake up, we go to work, we do the job, we run around, we've got families, we deal with the family, and it's like we're just, I don't want to say just on autopilot, but our days seem to go pretty standard, right? So when it's building up and there's something going on, we may not even most of us don't recognize that something's happening because we're not aware. We don't have self-awareness. So it's this emotional intelligence that we talked about last week, about we have intellectual intelligence, but also an emotional intelligence, and that emotions are there to indicate something. So when we are experiencing whatever emotion that may be, including fear, including anger, that they're there to communicate something's off, something's wrong, something needs to change. And so by paying attention to it, so it's not in the touchy-feely woo-woo kind of way, but it's about really paying attention to ourselves. The more we know ourselves and we know who we are and what our base states are and what our emotions are, and the more we're willing to look at ourselves, that is where we really make some incredible shifts and change in how we feel, that can build up our courage and strength to go through fear, to break through the fear.
Right. And one of the things I'd like to add to that is just working with people who have trauma issues, is that oftentimes there are people who are disconnected from emotion, so they don't even feel anything. I know that may be hard for a lot of people to imagine, but there are people who have been experienced trauma in their life, oftentimes in their childhood, and they are not connected with their emotions. So in that case, same thing about you saying that emotions are an indicator. I always tell people, remember, behavior is an indicator. So whatever people are in touch with, whether they're in touch with their emotional part of themselves or they're in touch with their behavioral part of themselves, remember, both of those are indicators, always. And
excellent point.
And it's worthwhile to look at that and to really say, okay, could I be fearful? I hope that as you listeners out there are listening to last week's segment and today, that you really give it some thought in terms of, okay, what parts of this fit me? What can I identify with? I'm going to encourage you to assume that it fits you, because it does, simply because you're a human being. These things that we've talked about last week and this week, all of us can identify with in some way, for sure.
It's part of the human condition, and especially in the society that we live in, and being able to manage this by developing these tools that we're talking about, critical for our feeling better.
So I have a question. Can someone defeat the fear dragon for good? And why or why not, in your opinion?
So I think that we can overcome bouts of fear. So when I was able to overcome the fear of leaving my job, and I've actually, so this is fast forwarding to the future. I've been in private practice full time for over 3 years now, and so these examples were back then. So it's possible to overcome an experience of fear or a situational fear. So because I am in full-time practice and have a successful practice here in Santa Fe, that I no longer have that fear. So in that particular situation, I was able to slay the dragon, if you will. However,
but you just took the leap, right? I mean, how did you overcome that fear? You just took the leap, and sometimes we have to.
Well, it turns out for myself that it became more detrimental. It was more harmful for me to stay. I mean, to leave. It was more harmful for me to stay than to go. So when I first started, it was, I'm safer to stay, and it's too risky to go. And at the very end, it was like, it became so intense for me that it was like all of these indicators. My body became sick. I had 3 bouts of bronchitis and pneumonia because I was in such a state of resistance of the change that was wanting to take place in my life, the change that I wanted to make and the change that was like happening for me. And so what I had to do.
Could you say that because I think this is good, could you say that you were kind of stuck in that state of fear, and that caused your body, that caused your body to get sick, that, affected how you were functioning, till you decided to face your fears.
Absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it presented itself in this way for me, is that I wanted to go to work less and less. I felt myself being more distracted at work, unfocused. I felt like I wasn't doing a good job because I wasn't. My heart wasn't in it. Although I'm a great worker, I wasn't working to the level of my standard. So I could feel that I had a disconnect with work already. I also had anxiety. And I also had panic attacks. So you mentioned that at the beginning of the show. So it would present itself with, I would have to pull over. I remember distinctly 3 separate times where I'd have to pull over to the side of the road and just allow myself to cry and breathe, and having to breathe deeply on my way to work. So those are all indicators. My body is trying to tell me, Lupita, you have to make a change here. This is no longer working for you, but I was resisting it. So the panic attacks, the anxiety attacks, the lack of focus, all of those things I've also felt, so I'm not just talking about, some concept or theory someplace out there. I'm talking about from firsthand personal experience. And so by being able to break down what was I afraid of and understanding how irrational those thoughts were, and then also being able to begin to think of the opposite of, well, I'm skilled. I'm good at what I do. I already have a part-time practice. I already have overcome a lot of, things that I needed to achieve in order to transition to full-time practice. And so I took the leap. I found a path and just, made the decision just one day of like, I can't do this anymore, and taking that leap of faith. And then once I took the leap of faith and I gave my notice, I had a lot of excitement. My fear shifted, still fearful, but not as intense, because I think I was more afraid of staying by that point than leaving. and taking that leap of faith and making that transition, it shifted into excitement and then shifted into still, trying to figure things out, but it dissipated. The fear dissipated. And then I was able to work with, what are the goals that I want to accomplish? And then shifted my focus into what I was creating instead of what I was resisting.
Well, what's interesting is your example, and I'm not saying this applies to you, but I'm going to take your example to kind of expand, which is fear can be very elusive. And I talk to people about it can be like holding a beach ball down in a pool of water and it pops up somewhere else, and putting the focus in the wrong place. So what I mean by that is you can really be afraid of failure, not you, Lupita, but somebody who's struggling with making a change in their life can be like, I'm afraid to make that change. I'm going to fail. But they stay hyper-focused on not leaving their job or not leaving their relationship, or, they stay focused on that instead of putting the spotlight on the real issue, which is I'm afraid to fail. There are so many people that are afraid to fail. So many.
Well, that definitely applies because that was me. I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to survive, so that, and in my sense of security came from that steady paycheck. And going into private practice was, okay, I'm not going to have that steady, exact set amount every single 2 weeks. So I had to really, and it was afraid of, well, what if I don't make it? What if I can't afford my mortgage? What if I can't afford to go and do that? What if I don't make it? So it was, you're dead on with that, Mary, because that was absolutely one of the greatest fears that I had, was that fear of failure. But it got to the point where it was, for me, it became a matter of like life and death. Because as I mentioned, the symptoms showed up physically in my body through my bouts of illness. Again,
well, and that's a very real thing. I mean, staying stuck in any of these things that we've talked about last week and this week can really be detrimental and life-threatening. That's a fact.
Mm-hmm. It is. And my husband can vouch for, the panic attacks that I'd have at night, right before I made the change, where I honestly thought that, people who have felt a full-on panic attack can be very misleading because it feels like either a stroke or a heart attack. I had one of those.
And mention that. I skipped over, and I apologized. I apologize, but I skipped over asking you about physical symptoms of fear. That seems like a great timing to talk about that. Because that's what you're mentioning, basically.
Absolutely, how it shows up in the physical body. So I had a full-on panic attack. So people might misunderstand that or make light of it, saying like, I had a panic attack. Until you've actually had one to the level or the extent, it does feel like a heart attack or a stroke. And then there's a spectrum, right? So that's not to discount or dismiss other physical reactions. So it could come in the form of a chronic ulcer, bleeding ulcers. It could come in the form of high blood pressure, an overactive heart or heart palpitations. It could come in the form of sleeplessness. And in my case, I actually became ill. Because of a high state of stress, constant state of stress, it completely threw off the balance of my hormone system as well as my immune system. So I had a very weakened immune system, and so I was very susceptible to illness. So I had, as I mentioned, 3 bouts of bronchitis. I had 2 bouts of walking pneumonia around that same time, a cough that would not ever go away. And so because I had a suppressed immune system because of a high stress. So lowered immune, high stress, a situation I was resisting made for a storm for a panic attack. So just short of going to the hospital, I recognized what it was. I was able to work through it. And then it was that. It's so sad to say, but it's true. And I don't mind sharing my personal experience because, again, it's part of the human condition. Every single one of us feels it. And I'm so glad that I can actually have experienced it so that I can understand it and help others through it. So when it got to that point, I understood then, if I don't make this change, it was life and death at that point. Who's to say what worse could have happened? Thank God it didn't.
Right. Yeah. No, it can. And, gosh, once you work through that, I think that's why you and I do the work that we do, is just caring so much about other people feeling like that, I feel compelled, and I know you do, passionate about helping people work through not just fear, lots of things, but definitely that's a big one. It's such an important topic and such an expansive topic that, I'm covering it in 4 segments because it's a pretty big deal for a lot of people.
It is. And because it
So,
affects so much of us,
yeah, I mean, well, everybody, right? To some degree, in some way.
Absolutely.
I know when you and I talked yesterday, we had both used the same word, spectrum. And so fear exists on a spectrum, and you will find yourself, I guarantee you already have found yourself somewhere on that spectrum of fear. Panic attacks being the most extreme end of the spectrum, but even fear like what I described having this morning when I went to the gym, that's on the lower end of the spectrum. But all of us continually, right, find ourselves on some place on the spectrum of fear, for sure. And then I think determining, once you kind of identify that, then you can determine what the intervention or what you need to do to alleviate that fear, either in the moment, or if it's a pattern of fear, then that's where you might have to really look in your toolbox and take out several things to deal with it. Next week,
I'm so glad that you're making this a four segment section, because I know you're going to talk a lot about like actual approaches in the next 2 sessions.
We are, and thanks. Next week we're having Rita Abeta, who runs our meditation programs here at Odyssey Counseling and Resilience Integrative Services. Rita has a day job in law enforcement, and so she is, absolutely aware of fear from that end. Seeing it, experiencing it, and reading about it. And she runs our meditation program. So she's going to come on and we're going to talk about how to use meditation as a way to overcome or deal with fear. So she'll be on. Remember that our show, Remotely Unique, is always on iTunes. So if you missed our segment last week or today, please, you can go on to iTunes and look under the podcast section and find us there. We do have a Facebook page, so please visit Remotely Unique on Facebook and like our page when you're there, and spread the word. Really, the things that we talk about are very intentional in terms of reaching out to people and helping you all deal with things that are common experience to all of us. And for those of you that may not want to talk to somebody, or maybe don't need to talk to somebody professional, you have the comfort of your own home or your smartphone, where you can bring up the podcasts, past and present, and listen to them. And so that's definitely a win-win. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of me at Remotely Unique. So it's remotely-unique.com. Or my business, Odyssey, that's ODYSSEY counseling, COUNSELING.com. Feel free to drop me a line. If you have any suggestions on shows in the future you'd like to see, topics, please don't hesitate to express that. And Lupita, I just want to really thank you for coming on. You have my complete admiration and respect, and I tell you, this will not be the last time that you come on my show, because you just have so many valuable insights to share with our listeners. So I appreciate it, and I know that they'll all be hearing from you in the future.
The pleasure is mine, Mary. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody. Have a great week. Until next Monday.
You're listening to Remotely Unique with Mary Baca, only on LA Talk Radio.